politically suspect here, but you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, I guess, is really what that says. So, you know, here's where I've been. I started a little company called the Las Vegas Sun, which is a newspaper in Las Vegas, Nevada, and discovered a program called GNU Emacs there. First time I fired it up on a VAX running Unix back in the day, I did the first thing it told me to do in the manual, which was meta X display time, which is supposed to display the time in what's called mode line, which is time. And it crashed the VAX. And so we got the VAX back up, and you know, the lead programmer came screaming over in his BMW because he worked at home at the time, but only about 4 blocks away. We got the VAX back up. He says, "What happened?" I said, "I don't know. I just fired up Emacs and I did display time." He's like, "Well, do it again." And sure enough, it crashed the VAX again. So that was my seminal experience with free software. You know, GNU Emacs is, of course, the initial program out of the Free Software Foundation. I ended up going to Convex because a guy called me on the phone one day because I'd been real loud on a thing called Usenet back in the day, and it was probably half an hour before I realized I was being interviewed for a job in Dallas, Texas. So he said, "Come on out and do the real interview," and I moved to Texas. And while I was at Convex, I sort of, you know, brought the GNU tape with me because I wasn't about to give up Emacs. And I got there and I, you know, proceeded to build Emacs, and I was using it. And Convex was licensing Emacs for their customers, for their OS. Convex did mini supercomputers, vector computers back in the mid-'80s. And we had their own Unix-based operating system and the whole 9 yards. Anyway, Emacs was something that our customers bought from us for the Convex platform. And I had GNU Emacs running, and one day I discovered that simply by moving Unipress Emacs aside, which was the proprietary software, and putting GNU Emacs in its place, we could close all of the open bugs. So we did. And I went to management and said, you know, you really ought to give $1,000 to the Free Software Foundation because our customers are happy and we're happy, and we have fewer programmers working on this now. You know, I did a couple of things at Convex, including I ended up porting GDB, which is a GNU debugger, to the Convex platform, and the software developers were very happy about that because it was better than the internally produced debugger. And then I made, you know, sort of a critical political mistake. I ported the GNU compiler, GCC, to the Convex platform. Now, Convex had 2 compilers. There was CC, the ordinary compiler, and there was VCC, which was the vectorizing, super optimizing compiler, which did a great job of taking care of the floating point units on a Convex, but did absolutely nothing for what's called scalar code optimization. And there's this thing called Ohm's law that says the more you optimize the parts of your program that can be optimized, the more and more the parts of your program that can't be optimized will come to dominate the runtime of the program, and sort of diminishing returns. GCC had a much better scalar code generator than VCC, and after I'd ported this thing to the Convex architecture, the marketing group started using it to win benchmarks, which didn't set well with the guy who ran the compiler group because we weren't using our own tools. I thought, well, heck, there's a lesson here. Let's study the compiler and do a scalar code optimizer, but apparently that was the wrong answer. I ran the system admin group there for a while, and then they promoted me to management, and I left, which is a reoccurring theme in my career. I went to Sun, also in Dallas, Texas, and ended up building out their internal worldwide network, or at least a fairly big portion of it, and spent several years sort of traveling around the world, putting in 56K lines and P1 lines and E1 lines, and eventually DS3s and that kind of thing. This was all sort of before most people had heard about the internet. It was a very interesting effect. Every time you go into a sales office in, you know, Indianapolis, Indiana, and you plug in the router, which we built out of Sun workstations, and you get the line up, the first thing people noticed was that email was faster. That's what counted for them. It was about communication. They didn't care that they had online access. It's just that, you know, all of a sudden they would respond to an email, and somebody in California would respond right back. This is something that everybody takes for granted now. We're all connected now, but back in 1987 or so, or, you know, 88, 89, it was a very different thing. Tadpole built notebooks out of Sun, and that was mostly an exercise in making Sandust, which was this very big thing, fit on what at the time was the maximum 6 gigabyte drive. And I stayed at Tadpole for several years. We eventually built what at the time was a really fantastically fast machine, which is a 100 megahertz Pentium notebook in the same form factor. We solved all the heat problems and everything. And lo and behold, I got to be the guy who did everything but Windows on the box, which included supporting something called Linux, because one of our customers wanted it. And that was really the first time I'd really laid my hands on Linux per se. And I was, impressed, but I took one look at the TPY driver and decided it needed help. Sort of between Tadpole and Wayport, I had my own company called Smallworks, which I mentioned before, and one of the things I noticed at Smallworks is we ended up, there were sort of 3 programmers and a sales guy, so we ended up with a lot more Linux machines and Sun machines, and we set out to do Sun stuff, because that's what we knew. So Linux even back then was sort of a really rapidly rising meme. Wayport, I got recruited by Wayport by a VC I knew. I was the CTO. Wayport is broadband and hotels, right? Sort of got Ethernet line by your desk in your hotel room or in a conference room for your wireless. By the time I left, we'd done 1,000 hotels, and every single one of them had at least one Linux box on site, which was the control plane for the entire thing. So, we did it with Linux. Our competitor did it with Windows. Slapper hit. Guess who won? Muzinki was my own startup, which was open source on 802.11. It really I got recruited out of Muzinki because it was not getting funded into Vivado, which was phased array Wi-Fi running Linux. And Netgate came out of Muzinki. I really strongly believe in free software versus open source. I've said everything open source in this presentation, mostly out of deference to what Scott wanted to call the conference. I think open source is a brand, and free software is a movement. I really encourage anybody here to go off and take a look at what Solomon wanted to do with free software in the GNU project. I think he had a point, and he may have been right. Software freedom was about the ability to share what you've done with other people, and open source is about a business model for collaboration. The two are the same, Bruce says, and I think they're actually very different. Okay, so, here's a thought. Innovation will occur. Right? And, companies, especially tech companies, but all companies are involved in innovation. You do planned incremental changes like new products or new features on your product, or you start trying a new product line, or that kind of thing. They're planned discontinuous changes like merging with an organization or changing your strategy, deciding that what you've been doing isn't going to carry you into the future, so you decide to change direction. Then there are the unexpected changes, right? Suddenly your product's illegal in some country, or your competitor has some new thing, and you're sitting, tied to a pole. And there's a lot of things called scenario planning around this third thing. But really, innovation has to occur in order for your company to continue to be. So, sort of take it as a lemma, innovation will occur. Well, as a son, I ended up working for a guy named Bill Joy, who some people may have heard of. And Bill Joy had this thing, it's called, Joy's Law, which was the number of smart employees in your company is the log of the number of employees in your company. If you say this in front of a really super technical audience, everybody will laugh. What he never did specify was the base. So, here's sort of a couple examples. The natural logarithm of 3 is 1. So, if you want to think of it that way, if you have 3 people in your company, one of them is smart. One of them actually gets things done. If you have 20 people in your company, you might have 3 smart people. And this is, diminishing returns, right? And you can see as you get to be really big companies, you don't get to add smart people as fast as the population of the company grows. I've also expressed, the log-based 10 out here, so you can see that as the base of the logarithm goes up, you have even a slower rate of return on the number of employees you hire. And finally, of course, the logarithm of 1 is 0. So if you're the only person in your company, it's almost impossible to measure how smart anybody is, at the least. And maybe you're just dumb for working by yourself. I don't know. So if you put these two things together, what do you get, right? Well, most of the smart people work somewhere else. And, it doesn't matter where you work. If you work at Microsoft or GE or the smallest company in the world, most of the smart people work somewhere else. You can't employ all the smart people. And Microsoft has done a great job about trying to convince people that they have all the smart people. And it can't be. The other thing you get is, innovation will occur. That's the dilemma we started with, but it's going to happen somewhere else. Smaller companies are easy to run. They're easy to finance. Smart people like to be in small companies because they like to change things. They like to be able to go to lunch and say, you know what, this isn't working, let's do something else. As you get to bigger and bigger companies, you end up with these layers of management to sort of distribute the message. You still have a small group of people making the change, but it gets distributed out to this very large audience, right? The people actually doing the work aren't in control of the direction of the company necessarily. So, I think open source or free software is an answer to the question, how can we leverage other people's work? But, knowing the answer without knowing the question is Jeopardy, the game show. Right? And at one point I was going to play Jeopardy here with people, but, and also in Jeopardy, not knowing the answer will cost you money, right? You lose your bet in Jeopardy if you don't know the question. There are other ways of getting leverage on other people's work. And there are more traditional things like joint ventures and consortia and licensing other people's code. But open source is sort of a new answer. But, again, I think it's important to realize what open source is. It literally is a way to find a way to bring in what other people have done. And to let other people succeed or fail on their ideas and then be able to leverage it. So, in terms of the broad spectrum of open source licenses, the OSI licenses, and this includes the GPL and the BSD license and the rest of them, all of them let you charge for distribution. A lot. You can charge $100,000 for your piece of GPL code. It's a true fact. Here's some free advice. Make sure you can justify the price. Because if you manage to sell one and it's not worth it, then you're when they get the source code, when they request and therefore receive the source code, it'll just leak out, and the price of your product will now be zero. But for applications that actually can bear the burden of a higher price, $1,000 price point or something, creating an application or something, you can actually ask for and receive that. But market-based economies are even sharper. There's no lock-in advantage, which is what the software industry is traditionally dependent on. You can still pick your customers. You don't have to sell to any one individual or company. You don't have to sell anything to your competition. This brings in the problem of being able to identify your competition. But you certainly don't have to, if you're Sun Microsystems, you don't have to sell something to SPI, even with open source. You don't have to distribute source code with the product. A lot of people think that's part of the rule, especially with the GPL. With the GPL, you have to include an offer to do so, but you don't have to package it along. And you can charge a reasonable fee, and it's not much. But you don't have to package the source code along with the product. And a lot of people think that's automatic. And the sort of the final, free open source, free/open source, kink is, if you don't distribute binaries to anybody, you don't have to send them source. So you can literally build service-based applications on top of complete GPL or open software and never risk a thing in terms of intellectual property. Yeah. There has been some discussion about approaching changing it, but here's the issue. The GPL and a lot of these other licenses are built on a legal concept called a derivative work. And, and having distributed a derivative work. And there's really no hook to get hold of something that hasn't been distributed. Even with the GPL, if you use internal to the company, you don't have to do anything about getting the changes back. It's just when you distribute it outside the organization. So, I think even Solomon has realized that this may be a leverage point that people can apply, and there are a couple other leverage points, especially with the GPL. But, again, web-based products and web-based services, you can use all the open source you want. And, you can keep it all proprietary if you want to. I don't think it's the best thing for you or the industry. But if you really are scared about giving away your secret sauce. you know, and then there's this whole new idea about the LAMP stack, which is Linux plus Apache plus MySQL plus PHP or Perl, which is, you know, what a lot of people build web applications out of these days. Netgate runs on a LAMP stack application called OS Commerce. Our whole front end for doing all the catalog sales is all done in LAMP. So our new startups, and I can't remember the name of them, but I know Tim Police is the CEO, and Kleiner Perkins funded them for some unknown amount of money, that are doing nothing but offering LAMP-based services. They pre-package all the stuff, test it, and say, this is good to go. And apparently people will pay for that. You know, I mean, Kleiner Perkins are the guys who started people like Sun and SGI and a bunch of other really successful startups. You know, they're sharp guys. Bill Joy actually just joined them, it turns out. You know, so I mean, there must be a huge business out there in order for them to put a couple $1 million down on what people have to give away as an end product in terms of the source. Of course, all the value there is in the integration and testing, which are still hard things to do for a product. It's still part of the service you can offer. Another thing you can do is hosted open source. You know, OS Commerce turns out to be fairly difficult to set up correctly. It's hard. It's like software. It's hard to do the first time, and it's really easy to clone. So, you know, there are companies out there who offer hosted OS Commerce setups, so you can just start stuffing things in the catalog. And there's a potential for a blades and razors strategy here as well. Does everybody know what blades and razors is? That's where Schick would send you the razor, but they sell you the blades. They sell you the thing that you buy over and over again. And you know, another thought, and sort of, you know, as we go through these, you know, the thought experiment is, does open source change any of these, or is it impossible to advantage yourself of open source in any of these? So, you know, 5, you know, keys to success in tech, at least, you know, the 5 things that I found that you have to do. You know, you have to create new products, or, you know, change your product to continue to bring the incremental revenue. You have to grow the business. You know, static businesses don't last very long because somebody else innovates and your market goes elsewhere. You got to get the product quality up at first release. Now, you know, open source and free software helps a lot here because a good part of your code has already been through more testing than you could ever afford. You know, Linux itself has been through more testing than any organization could ever afford. You know, you have to support current old releases. You have to support your customer base while you're driving the new innovation. You know, customers without support go elsewhere. You know, Jason and I were just discussing how good Apple is at this these days. And Apple, by the way, their base OS is open source. The kernel inside Mac OS X is completely open. You know, essentially a lot of plays around, you know, getting third-party developers in, getting people to, you know, advantage themselves of your tools or platform or whatever, add their value on the side, even if it's just service, and continue to sell. So this is really a way of leveraging their sales force or leveraging their customer base. Again, it's sort of more sales force than you can afford to approach. And sales forces are, you know, direct sales forces are very expensive things. And then you got to keep the employees around. You get too much churn going internally, no forward progress can happen. So, a lot of employees now want to be able to work on open source. And if they're working on your open source project versus theirs, so much the better for you, if you're allowing that kind of thing. But this is sort of a new thing. It's actually gotten difficult to retain employees who can't work on open source even outside the corporation. So, you know, here's one thing I hear a lot. You know, open source destroyed my business model. Well, you know, where my business model was sort of counting on lock-in. You know, the automobile destroyed horse and buggies. You know, Ethernet won. And this happens over and over and over again. And the message here is not so much you got to stand up and fight and say, you know, this can't happen because I'm dead. Well, you know, the message is, you know, adapt or die. You know, that process of evolution here. This is a new thing. I don't see it going away. A lot of other people don't see it going away. Some people don't like it. That doesn't mean it's going to stop. You know, product cycles are getting shorter. Has anybody noticed this? You know, I mean, a lot of companies in the sort of end of the .com time were literally trying for 3-month product cycles. And one of the interesting things about open source is a mentality that says we ship it when it's ready. It sort of relaxes all that stuff. But you can add incremental features between releases. You know, customers can add their own things. Yeah. Yeah, Yeah, I really liked, you know, somebody referenced Paul Graham earlier. It was actually Bruce referenced Paul Graham without naming by name. Said somebody wrote a book about hackers and painters. And Paul Graham had a company called ViaWeb, and they had written their entire application list. There were 3 guys in a box. Sold the company for $45 million to Yahoo. Paul Graham was literally so worried that Yahoo couldn't see the value in 3 guys in a box that he went out and hired a bunch of friends to come in for a couple weeks so it looked like they had more programmers. And you know, this is all in the public now, but one of the things they found is they could fix the application while they were on the phone with the customer. They could literally make the customer believe if they wanted to. They didn't say they didn't do this, but they said they could if they wanted to make the customer believe that the error had never happened, that it was in their imagination. Because they could fix the error underneath the customer's current session. And you'd never think about doing that with an app you deploy. So, you know, my message here is, you know, really it's quite simple. You know, it's here. You can either stand in front of the train, or you can try to get on the train. You know, some other ideas in terms of what I think is going to happen. You know, you heard a lot of talk this morning about big companies, IBM, HP, Novell. You know, Novell only has 5,800 employees. Well, which isn't big in terms of IBM or Sun or whatever, but it's pretty big to me. You know, I don't have 5,799 people around me every day. But the interesting thing of that slide was the very next point, which is they're distributed over 100 locations. If we're to take an average, they've got less than 60 people in the average office. Now, Provo's a big plant, and Massachusetts is a big plant, but everywhere else must be, by definition, much, much smaller than that. So, you know, this has already happened to Novell. It's happened to Sun. It's happened to Cisco. The guy who maintains Cisco CLI works out of his house in Baltimore by himself every day, and Cisco loves it. So yeah, I think you'll find very small teams, and you know, 25 is sort of an any joke with some friends of mine, and we keep saying the next company will be called 24 because that will be the maximum number of employees you can have without splitting the company up. And this is again a sort of small group. When the group gets too big, other things happen than work. Right? Some of them are fun, some of them are very not fun, and I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about. I think we'll see a lot of evolutionary development where a product will come out and then it will sit there and evolve rather than in big chunks. There'll be lots of little chunks. Even, you know, somebody mentioned web apps, and that's a classic example, but a lot of people have gotten very good at releasing minor patches to introduce functionality now. You know, Apple's OS X does this. I run a couple Debian boxes. They've got AppCron running. Things update. I get a message after it's happened. So this is sort of the new paradigm. There aren't big point releases. There are a lot of incremental changes in the source base and in the resultant distribution base. I think we're going to see a lot of polymorphic late binding languages, and what that means is things like Java and Perl and PHP. You know, I love to write in C. I know a lot of people love to write C++. It turns out to be very difficult to not write errored programs in them. Very, very difficult. As the applications get bigger and more distributed, that problem gets worse, not better. So a lot of people have started to really advantage themselves with things like Perl and Python, and I'm going to mention Lisp here. So, you know, examples, ViaWeb, Paul Graham and Robert Morris, yes, the guy who wrote the worm, and one other guy whose name I don't know, you know, basically founded a company out of their back pockets, sat in a room, got the whole thing running, had lots of customers, and sold it in less than 3 years for $45 million. That, you know, that's value creation. That's, you know, $15 million a piece. Delicious is this set of 7 guys, and there was an article on them very recently in Wired that says we pay our rent by buying coffee. When they do meet, they meet in a coffee shop. They don't have an office. You know, an office for 7 people is going to run you $3,000–4,000 a month, and that's money you could apply to something else. A new server every month if you want to think of it like that. So I think the sort of distributed collaborative work environment is actually a very new way of working, and I think we'll see a lot more of it. You know, other things to consider in terms of where the application space might be going or where the technology might be going. What I like to call the gigahertz deathmatch, where AMD and Intel sort of slap each other back and forth every 6 months about who's got the faster processor. If you take a look, it leveled out about 2 years ago. There's still some incremental changes, but we should have been at 4 gigahertz 6 months ago if the curve from 2 years ago had to continue to happen. And nobody's even talking about doing 4 gigahertz anytime soon. So, there's a leveling off. And what this means is that you can't count on Moore's law to get your application to go faster. And what a lot of the companies, AMD, IBM with its Tower, which is using Apple, Intel, Sun, are all talking about is multiple execution units on the die. So you'll have N CPUs in the thing we call it CPU. Well, you have to be able to write the program to take advantage of that. You have to write multi-threaded programs or something like that. So I think that single-threaded programs will start to be not the norm because people want to continue to make their apps run faster. We may find new languages like Erlang that are very good at advantaging themselves to these new processors. 64-bit, I think it's going to be a bigger revelation than people realize because it makes new VMs possible. Right now we've got this process model, right? We've got a 32-bit space and other process has to fit in a 32-bit virtual space. Well, a 64-bit space isn't 2 times as big, it's 2 billion times as big. So literally in the 64-bit address space, you could have 2 billion 32-bit applications all running in their own address space and then use the VM to map them in. That's a pretty powerful thing, and it gets rid of a lot of inefficiencies even in the Linux kernel about running kernel code and then running the application code. And running kernel code, running the application code, you have to be very careful about crossing that boundary both ways. It takes a lot of time. It's called context switching. There could be very new ideas for VMs for basically how the computer is architected or how the operating systems are architected that completely eliminate that boundary. You could end up running all the applications in the same address space relocated. Anybody here older than 40 years old, I said relocation, you probably just barf. But and the other thing I want to say is, there's been a lot of discussion about protecting the core of what you do. I forget exactly how Bruce said it, but you got to protect your differentiation. And I'm of a different mind. I think you got to throw your differentiation on the table and throw the GPL on top of it. And here's why. Now, one of a couple things will happen. Either your competitors will pick up your differentiation and use it and maybe improve it. And if they improve it, they have to give it back, and that's good for you because you didn't pay for that development. 2, you could have your competitors following around this trail of breadcrumbs you leave, just really concentrating on incorporating your last change while you're working on the next thing, and that's a great position to be in. Your competitors are a generation or maybe 2 behind. Or 3, the thing that everybody sort of innately gets in their gut, and the reason everybody fears doing this is maybe you're not as good as the other guys. But maybe that's okay for society as a whole. Maybe if they're better, you still get to take advantage of their improvement. So I actually am a big advocate about throwing everything on the table. When I was at Mazinki, it was actually very liberating because for the first time, I didn't have to worry about the corporate lawyers making me sign an NDA before I talked to somebody, or making them sign an NDA before I talked to them. I got to make decisions, and the decision I made was, I'm just going to talk about it. Well, the result was I could talk about a lot of things we were doing, and nobody else who was doing 802.11 at the time would. And so we scared a lot of people because we were out building a very, very big market presence with 3 people. We looked like a much bigger company than we were. And I literally found out afterwards we'd scared companies like Buffalo, which is a big Japanese electronics firm. And we had a lot of attention from the guys at Broadcom, and at Theros it turns out. So that, being able to just sort of casting off all that NDA stuff and just doing it rather than worrying about protecting it, I found to be a very liberating experience. So, here's my parting shot, and I have no idea if I'm over or under time, but it's a Bacon quote I really like. If you're not ready to get with the program, then you got to expect bad things to continue to happen. Any questions? Okay, so I told Scott I was going to talk about this. the origins in Netgate were basically when I decided Mizinki wasn't going to make it, when we weren't going to get funded, and my partners insisted that we get outside funding before they would build the hardware, we got to, prototype stage. I had no choice but to fold the company. And fortunately, I got somebody at Bravado came in and just sort of swooped me up. But when my wife and I moved to Spokane, Washington, she's also technical, and there was nothing for her to do. While we were at Mizinki, we discovered several suppliers in Taiwan and Africa for antennas and things called pigtails and these little cards. This actually turns out to be a high-power 802.11b card. And she decided that she would start trying to sell them. And I remember the first time, these, when we bought them 2 years ago, these were about $100 a piece. I think they were $93 a piece. And I remember buying the first box for about $2,000 because they came 22 a box, and thinking, well, if nothing else, I can get rid of them at cost. 2 years later, and it was 2 years last summer from that first box we were doing, and I don't mean to sound like I'm bragging, but it really is possible to do this. Last year we did 1.2 million. Not $1.2 million worth of this kind of stuff. And until I got out of Bravado last year, we had no differentiation in the product line. We were literally selling things that anybody else could sell. And the vendors didn't do a good job about channel control, so everybody's into very thin margins on them. The reason that we're succeeding has got nothing to do with the technology that we do, and everything to do with how we conduct business. It's the intangible. It's the things that other people who start companies like this don't do, like return phone calls, or open 8 to 5 or reasonable hours, or return email. And all this stuff sounds very simple to do, but a lot of technology types aren't very good at disciplining themselves to do this. And I know that I still hesitate to pick up the phone and call a customer back, but I do it. Because, until you can talk to the customer and engage in a conversation, you're never going to make the sale. Now, we are advantaged because we got there first and we have a little better pricing and that kind of thing. But, we've survived a lot of competition in this place. What we do now is we started putting a lot more smarts into the product. So we've got some, I've actually had a chance to spend a year now re-engineering the product line. And so we're doing more embedded Linux stuff now again. But, we got to a point where we could move to Hawaii. We just moved here 6 months ago on the back of, my wife and that first 20 cards. So, but I've been doing open source and GPL stuff for a long, long time. And other companies I've had, when I was at SmallWorks, we open sourced the firewall and VPN products we had. They were on Solaris at the time, but anything else? Thanks. By the way, I want to point out, I'm sure I have the oldest machine in the room. Huh? Barely, yeah. It's a 1998 laptop. It's a 400 megahertz P2.